Episode 9 of the Beth Zemsky Podcast. Interact. Interconnect. You're connected to the Beth Zemsky Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Beth Zemsky Podcast. I'm Ryan Garza from Nonpod, the nonprofit podcast community, here with Beth Zemsky and friend. And Beth, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited to be back today, and I'm really excited to have my buddy Eleanore here because we're going to talk a lot about narrative and narrative strategy and how that fits into movement building. And I'm super excited about Eleanore being here with Ryan to talk about communication and strategy and how to move all of our narrative communication to a higher level. Yeah,
this is going to be awesome. Great to have you here. Eleanore, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm really, really happy to be here and excited to talk about all the things that Beth just said we were going to talk about.
So let's do it. But first, we wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the Beth Zemsky Podcast audience and talk a little bit about how you two maybe met and got involved working with each other.
Sure. Well, I have been in the Twin Cities since 1998, so it's been like 20 years now. And for much of my history, I was actually doing environmental justice, climate justice, food justice kind of work, which is the context that we met in. And for the past 7 years, though, I was working with an organization called Line Break Media, doing communications consulting and video production. And I very recently, just the middle of June, decided to leave Line Break to pursue my own narrative strategy consulting independently in an organization that I'm calling Dreams to Power. And basically the work that I do is helping individuals and organizations to tell more effective and compelling and persuasive stories about the work that they do and the change that they want to see. And that kind of falls under the big banner of narrative strategy. And a lot goes into that, different training, workshops, ways to think about the world. And I've had the pleasure of working with Beth on some of those things as well.
Yeah, and Beth, Eleanore mentioned environmental justice, which I think came up briefly in our last episode.
Yeah, so we actually met, I don't know how long ago. It feels like over a decade. And I was doing intercultural organizational development and equity work with an organization called the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which is actually an international organization working on sort of food justice, environmental justice, and thinking about agricultural policy as it connects to that. And you were a fairly new staff member when I started doing that work, which is how we originally met. But before we go on, I want to make sure everybody listening, first of all, knows your last name, and you don't have a website yet, right?
And how to spell your first name, too, which is really interesting.
Because it's a little unusual, right?
It is. So my first name is spelled the European way, so there's an extra O in it.
The European way is always cooler, just in general, right?
So it's Eleonore, and my last name is Wesserle, or if you're saying it in German, would be Wesserle, which is Wesserle. And I will have a website coming soon, dreamstopower.org. For now, I have that email, so it would be eleonore@dreamstopower.org.
Can we mention the origin of the name of the organization briefly?
Yeah. So, there's this phrase that gets used a lot in movement circles, talking about speaking truth to power. And it's a phrase that Bayard Rustin originated and was popularized by the Quaker peace and anti-war movement. And sort of the idea of speaking truth to power is that, we need to be courageous and really tell the full spectrum of our experiences and everything that all the stories that power suppresses, we need to be truthful and honest about. But one of the things as I've been working, and this isn't just me that has been thinking about this, is that, there's lots of different kinds of truth. And so often when we're trying to speak truth in a way to make change, we're speaking the very negative truth. We're speaking the truths of our pain. We're speaking the truths of our suffering. And the thing with that is that it creates validation among folks who have experienced that pain and suffering. But
That's certainly important to do as well, right?
Absolutely. But in terms of power doesn't actually feel threatened by us speaking the truth of our suffering, because power is what orchestrated the suffering in the first place. Power is intimately familiar with all of the ways that people are suffering, and if anything, it's almost like a check mark of like, oh great, the system is working exactly as we've designed it, thank you for telling us.
And sometimes they get gleeful about the suffering.
Absolutely. It's celebratory for them, right? And so, but within truth, there's another kind of truth that we can speak, and that's the truth of our dreams. And it's really when we speak our dreams to entrenched power, then entrenched power starts to get nervous, because when we speak our dreams, that's when we're putting forth the idea of a better world, not just for ourselves, but for anybody else who might be listening. And really, when you think about it, not even when you think about it, like on its face, we have a better offer than the one that entrenched power currently has on the table for us. We have visions of people being able to take care of each other and having our needs met on a world that has enough for all of us, And it's very important to notice that kind of language is not often the language that we get to use or that we end up using. And that's not an accident. That's like a strategic advantage for the opposition. It's a strategic advantage for entrenched power.
And so just to connect it to what we've talked about on the podcast before, and part of the reason I was so excited to have Eleonore come is we've been talking in the podcast before about the difference of reacting to current conditions. And when we do that, we're inside the frame that those in power and those in the opposition to our worldview want us to be inside. Right, so we're doing their work for them. Absolutely. When we repeat their frame. And the other thing, just to harken back to what we've talked about before, we've spent some time on the podcast talking about how people often get engaged around pain and fear and anger, but we stay engaged and build new visions for the future and build movements about hope and vision. Right, so that's stuff we've talked about before in the podcast, and that Eleanor's work is actually about how do you make that shift? How do you move from being in the construct of current power and the way things are now to imagine a different sort of future and align our narratives around that future so that we're creating it by the telling of it? We're welcoming people into imagining that a different world is possible and sort of feeling it in our bodies, and then having the work of our hands and our feet and our marches and our movements aligned to create that dream. So that was part of the reason I was super excited to have you here.
Yeah. One of the quotes from that you first said to me that I first heard from you, Beth, that I reference a lot in the work that I do is the most successful thing that dominant culture has ever done is to limit our imagination of what's possible.
I started talking about it as colonizing our imagination. But yes, I remember saying that to you.
Yeah. And so I really see a lot of the work that I do as holding space for people to imagine, often in ways that, particularly the more sort of professionalized you get in the nonprofit system, and we're not always allowed to dream in those scenarios, but dreaming is exactly what needs to happen if we're going to be making any kind of proactive movement forward.
So one of the things I just want to say about this dreaming thing is we're going to talk in a minute about what is narrative strategy and how do we do it and all that. But I want to really underline this thing that Eleonore said, because right now, given what's going on in the world, if we're going to bed every night with anxiety and worrying about all the things that are happening and potentially having nightmares about it, it is really hard to dream in the middle of a nightmare.
Literally dream.
Literally dream. Wow, yeah. Literally go to bed, have dreams that are enhancing of our bodies and rejuvenating sleep and waking up feeling positive and refreshed. Right? I mean, there's like neurotransmitter things that dreaming does for us. And it's really hard to do that in the middle of having nightmares, in the middle of going to bed with anxiety and tossing and turning and not getting into REM sleep, literally, right? How that impacts us. So this idea about dreaming is not only important for our organizations and our movements, frankly, it's really important for our physical and psychological health. It's one of the decolonization pieces.
Yeah, and so the other reason we were really excited to have Eleonore here today is because, so me and her, we're kind of in the same business, actually. There's this whole sort of strategic narrative thing. And before we started recording here, I was talking about how I've never looked at what I do in the terms that Eleonore does. Like I do what I do sort of in the process of helping organizations kind of develop that narrative for the overall narrative of their podcast. And normally what I do is I'll kind of take that sort of pre-existing content and I'll kind of help them adapt that into an audio format. And what I realized talking to Eleanor is that I actually kind of do some of that stuff, but I hadn't really had any system behind it or anything like that. I'd been kind of doing it somewhat intuitively. So we wanted to talk about that as well. We're going to go ahead and take a quick little break here. We're going to come back. This is normally when we talk about current events, but we're going to do something a little different this time. And we're going to try to wrap them all up into kind of one segment today. So we're going to be right back. Thanks for listening to the Beth Zemsky podcast. And welcome back to the Beth Zemsky podcast, here with Beth Zemsky and Eleonore, our special guest today. And so we're going to roll right into it. So we're going to talk about narrative strategy. And I guess as such, we should probably talk about what exactly narrative strategy is.
Great, yeah. So
Start you off with an easy one.
I find that it's easiest to explain it sort of first with some examples. But
So let me ask the question. So Eleonore, you've been doing this work in various ways, right? So when you were at IATP, you were doing I remember us having coffee and us talking about this before Linebreak was created. And then you created Linebreak partly to be able to get stories out there in a different way. So I think it would be helpful for folks to hear about what led you to think about this way, right?
Well, so previous to working at IATP, I was working at the Women's Environmental Institute, which is a very small environmental justice organization. At least it was pretty small. I don't know where they're at now. And together with the Environmental Justice Advocates of Minnesota, we're doing some very neighborhood, hyper-local based climate justice projects. And we were part of this loose network of small environmental justice organizations across the country that would have webinars and phone calls every once in a while. And the majority of these organizations, all of these organizations were place-based in some way or another. The majority of them were either POC, people of color run, or indigenous person run. And this was towards the tail end of the Bush administration, so 2007-ish, where we all thought that we were the most polarized nation ever. And God,
Who knew, right?
Right. And oh man, we're really in the sink on climate change and all this stuff. And so all of these environmental justice folks across the country were sort of thinking okay, how can we really bring climate justice as the way that we talk about climate change to the forefront? And so climate justice would be a framework in which, you're really thinking about who created the problem, who has capacity to address the problem, and really making sure that the folks who are currently being most impacted by climate change are also the first to get help and all that kind of stuff. Unbeknownst to us, there was also a similar loose coalition of national level environmental organizations, big ones like National Resource Defense Council, Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, all the biggies like that were having a similar conversation, but were kind of going in the exact opposite direction, where they were looking at how conservative the world is, and thinking, okay, how can we have our story hit basically our enemy? How can we have our story be picked up, and how can we have climate change be cared about by conservative white males, essentially? So
this is something we've talked about on the podcast also, about who do you imagine your audience to be? I mean, this is like power analysis 101 in community organizing. Who are you trying to influence? And so the idea was that we've talked about before is if you're trying to influence the dominant culture, how does that, this is what the colonizing imagination, you're trying to think into their framework to influence them, but all that does is actually reinforce their framework because now they've just co-opted your message.
Yes, that's exactly right. And what you're saying is exactly what happened with this, where all those national level organizations decided, okay, they literally decided we are not going to talk about climate change. We're not even going to use the word climate anymore. And we're going to talk about all of these energy efficiency and renewable energy standards as energy independence. And so that was the frame that they were running with. And back then, framing wasn't really something that we talked about popularly, but I know.
For people listening, Beth is pointing to herself right now.
Beth was, and other people that, I was really fortunate to have a lot of very culturally rooted mentors and supervisors, and at the time, mostly folks of color who were also thinking about culture change as a prerequisite to policy change. And so when you think about culture change, putting in a frame on the issue of climate change, putting in a frame like energy independence does nothing to shift the culture, because you're just like what you were saying, you're tapping into that dominant narrative of, the U.S. is needing to be this isolationist national. It's like a very nationalistic frame, frankly. And
look where it got us.
Right. And now, it's a very Islamophobic frame. It's a very xenophobic frame, right? Because you're talking about energy independence, and it does nothing. It says nothing about the production of greenhouse gases. It says nothing about limiting emissions to the climate.
Well, and that frame also got us into things like fracking and pipelines and some of the other battles where, because the emphasis that a lot of the environmental organizations went with was in energy independence, and now some of those same organizations are fighting the repercussions of that, right?
Right, because under energy independence, you can drill for all the oil you want as long as it's within our borders. You can do fracking for natural gas all you want as long as it's within our borders. And just as you pointed out, the energy independence policies that actually did end up getting passed, which had some good things about, fuel efficiency and renewable energy standards and all that stuff, also had the subsidies within them that allowed the fracking boom to happen. And now...
So what did that insight lead you to?
Well, that was really... I had been doing in a lot of even as I was doing food justice, climate justice work, I was often in a communications position. And I think that experience with the contrast of the frames of climate justice and energy independence really made me have to think back to, okay, if we're doing policy change in a context of a particular frame, our policies aren't going to actually work. We actually need to be changing our frames, and that means paying attention to the stories that we're putting out there, paying attention to how the words that we choose emphasize and support particular worldviews and particular beliefs, and that if we're actually going to be making change in a movement way, in a policy way, even in like electing the right people to office sort of way, we need to be telling stories that are outside of the frames of the dominant toxic culture, and that actually showcase what it is that we want for the world and how we want to get there.
So one of the things that we've talked about, it's actually something George Lakoff says, is to fight for what's right, you first have to say what's right and why.
Yeah. There's also a phrase, and I'm not going to be able to remember who said it first, but that the point of a good message isn't to say what's popular, it's to make popular what needs to be said.
And so I wanted to pivot real quickly. Like I said, we're doing something a little differently today. We're kind of doing the curriculum and current events segments kind of together. You mentioned a few minutes ago about analyzing problems and discovering who created them. And before we started recording here, we're talking about some of the current events we wanted to cover. And we didn't want to get too deep into some of the stuff that 45 has been up to, because we could do hours and hours about just that. But you did want to talk about, Beth, specifically about how A lot of times problems are created so that someone can step up to fix them.
Yeah, so I've been, as folks who listen to the podcast before have heard me talk about, is I really want to pay attention to the patterns of what are happening rather than the specifics. So as soon as we get down the rabbit hole, the specifics, we're into the crazy kind of stuff that gives us nightmares, and we're inside that frame. So there's two things I want to talk about. One is just the general pattern, and then I want Eleanor to give an example about what's happening at the border as this example of framing. Okay? So one of the things that I'm paying attention to is just a pattern where 45 creates a crisis, and the one this week, there were two this week, one was about trade, right? The tariffs, et cetera. So creates a crisis and then steps in to solve the crisis as if he didn't create it, right? So there's a couple of things about that I just want us to be paying attention to. One is during the campaign, one of the things he said was, I'm the only one who can fix things. So this whole pattern of creating a crisis, whether it's about North Korea or whether it's about tariffs or even whether it's about the zero tolerance and the families, then he has some kind of interaction. Like this week, it was with the president of the EU, and he created this crisis, and then he's like, I'm going to solve it. And so part of the thing that just galls me is all the headlines are Trump made a deal. Actually, he did not make a deal, where what they agreed to was actually the last thing that the Obama administration had worked on with the European Union. So things are the same as they were, except now he created a crisis that then he solves, supposedly, without solving it, right? So I think we have to pay attention to that pattern, because what it does is reinforce him as the authoritarian figure. So we have to pay attention to that. The second thing is also paying attention to our reaction. So I was really thinking about today was really, I know Ryan's done some work with the Domestic Abuse Project, but I'm really thinking about my days as a therapist working with domestic violence survivors, and I'm really thinking about the cycle of violence. So what happens in the cycle of violence is that there's tension building. What is he going to do? He's making things bad. What's the next outrageous thing he's going to do? And then he does it. Right? So we've got this tension building, this act of absurdity, and then he supposedly, I've got air quotes, solves it, and then we all feel this relief, which is what happens in the cycle of violence.
There's the honeymoon period, as they refer to it in the cycle. Yeah.
Right. And what happens over time with cycles of violence is that we get conditioned to it, and the violence, the abuser, the cycle of violence is it gets more frequent and more intense.
And normalized, it begins to feel normal.
Exactly. So I think we just need to pay attention to that pattern and not fall into, oh, look, he just solved the crisis that he just created.
Right. And isn't he a great guy that families are being kept together at the border now?
Right.
Can you talk about the progressive frame that happened around the zero tolerance and family separation and your suggestion about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And all of this plays into narrative strategy is, you know, when he creates these crises, he's really manufacturing a situation so that he can get the outrageous thing that he wants in the end. And so when the situation was happening with families being separated at the border and children being ripped from their families, those were the headlines. Children are being ripped from their families, kept in cages. And the majority of the sort of progressive left response ended up being framed as keep families together, while there were these folks who were majority, you know, like immigrants themselves, majority folks of color, who are saying things like, well, is that actually the limit of the frame that we want?
Like, is that a big enough dream?
Exactly, because we see with that frame of keep families together that the solution that Trump and his administration has proposed is to keep families together in cages, right? And so that the bigger dream, first of all, is at its base taking away the things that are harmful, so abolishing ICE, that's been the rallying cry, but also really expanding that dream out to the recognition that migration is a human right, and that the ability for people to move from place to place when they need to move from place to place is a human practice that we have been doing since we have been, you know, human. And before. And also taking a look at how the U.S.'s foreign policies are actually destabilizing the countries that folks are coming from in the first place.
Don't get me started, yeah.
Right. And so, I recently...
So the dream piece, because I want you to talk about how. But I think what's important is sometimes on progressive, we have our signs abolish ICE, right? And we don't do the, freedom of movement is a human right, or even a dream about, what does it mean to be free? Being free means the ability to move and to have a better life, right? So they're not sort of the dream piece. We just put up the negative without even and then people dismiss it. Oh, they're just crazy. They want to abolish ICE without actually putting out the other piece.
Right. And there's a framework that I developed when I was at Line Break Media, just from, I have to count it out at some point, but there's literally hundreds of interviews that I've done that were essentially key informant interviews for videos and all of these things. And that combined with some of the frameworks from organizations like the Center for Media Justice, the Center for Story-Based Strategy, thinkers like Beth Zemsky, as well as Ricardo Levins-Morales, really, for me, crystallized out that there's really three essential elements to any persuasive message. And because it helps for things to be short and rhyming, I called them now, wow, and how. And so the now is essentially identifying the problem. It's speaking that truth to power, right? It's identifying the problem, and it's talking about the problem in a way that validates the experiences of the people who are experiencing the problem and gives analytical insight as to why the problem is happening for people who don't understand why the problem is happening. And then the wow piece is really the part that gets left out of, like you were saying, so much progressive messaging. The wow is the vision. It's what is the world that we're actually trying to create with this? What's the big dream? What's even the little dream if we're not talking about the world and we're talking about our neighborhood? If we put a stop sign up on this intersection, what is that dream of safety for our kids, for example, to be able to play in the street or whatever? And then the how, of course, is okay, so what's the work that needs to get done that will bring us from this problematic now to this vision of the wow? And the wow, Adrienne Marie Brown is another thinker that has really influenced a lot of my work. And she talks about it as a horizon line, that the wow isn't actually a solid destination. It's not if we do everything right, 20 years from now, we'll have utopia and we'll be there. It's that if we do everything right, 20 years from now, we'll be able to do the work that we wanted to today and keep pushing it forward every day as we're, growing and responding to different human situations. But the wow is that's really what we need to be talking about,
Because what often happens in progressive circles, and this ties into what we've talked before about values-based framing, right? How do we say, Eleonore and I have done some work together around this that has been super important for my learning, is because what we do is we do a now, as Eleonore said, that's often about our pain, and then we do a how about how to fix our pain. So we move from here's what's crappy, here's what doesn't work, and here's a policy solution. And we often get incredibly wonky about the policy solution. And so what Eleanor's framework allows us to do is say, if we take the family on the border thing, it's so the now is families are being separated, families are coming to the United States, they're being separated at the border because of a cruel, inhuman policy of separating families that is caused by how the United States has had policies to destabilize countries around the world economically in terms of the war, quote unquote, war on drugs and climate refugees, right? And we can go into further analysis, right? But this is a now that, as Eleanor is saying, that's framed with some analysis. It's not, and so we're not doing the parents who have come to the United States illegally are separated from the kids. Because even progressive media is saying that. They're not doing a now that is all talking about parents are escaping violence and economic oppression in their countries because of U.S. policies. They're coming to the border. And so we should keep families together. I mean, like even that would be better. But what we're not doing is this is what's happening now. The wow would be, as some version of Eleanor is suggesting, you know what, family migration, people migration is part of what's made our planet vibrant. It's part of what's allowed economies to grow. It's part of it's a human right to be able to move from place to place in order to feed our families and to have a quality and a cultural vibrancy. I made that up.
I think, yes, and I think
and then the how is, here's the policy we want.
And I think also in terms of migration and immigration, one of the things that, again, progressives really missed, like during the Obama administration, the foreign policy was just as awful as under any conservative administration that we've had. And, I recently took a trip to Honduras, and there was a right-wing coup, and there's a major human rights crisis now because of the right-wing president there that is assassinating people who are fighting for their rights left and right. And that president was installed during the Obama administration, and the Obama administration did not challenge the election, did not challenge the situation. And now what we're seeing is folks from Honduras being one of the populations that are being specifically targeted by the Trump administration for deportation, right? With no analysis about the way that U.S. military aid continues to flow to a country that is violating all kinds of human rights. And again, to get back to the wow, there's no mention of we are all on this planet together. And we are sharing this incredibly fragile sort of skin on this giant, iron rock that's flying through space. And that when we think about safety and community and families being able to live good lives, that it can't just end at our borders. It has to be about any family on any spot on this planet, which is something that I think was forgotten during the Obama administration when we were able to prioritize some of the changes that we needed domestically, but we're allowing all of these really terrible things to happen internationally.
Yeah. So two things. It sounds like the progressive media, the vast left-wing conspiracy could probably benefit from giving Eleanor a call here. And on one hand, you think that there would be people, that are thinking this stuff already, and that it would be, in that broader consciousness a little more, but it really hasn't been. And the second thing is that part of that challenge to me seems like it would be that everything does have to be short and catchy, and it has to rhyme, and it has to be, how do we kind of get over that challenge?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there are some people who are doing this. Like George Lakoff's been doing this work. Drew Western's been doing this work. Obama had some of these people during the 2008 campaign consulting with him, right? And so some of the wow stuff that he did. But what happens often is then the politicians get into these systems and structures. And you've heard me say before, every system is exquisitely designed to produce the result it gets. So, so part of the challenge is how do you keep doing a wow when the systems you're in, whether it's the nonprofit industrial complex, right, where you have to speak into foundation language sometimes, or so it's about how do you keep the wow alive without necessarily slipping into the dominant culture frames of now from only a pain place without an analysis into a how place that's all wonky, right? And so I think having the networks of people like, you, Ryan, helping with the podcast, or Eleanor helping construct messages, or, me doing the, intercultural, intersectional OD stuff, but it has to be systematized. Yeah. Right? Because the system, the way it is it just pulls us in that colonizing kind of way.
Yeah, and speaking of which, we did want to talk a little bit about how you specifically do your work. I think we talked sort of in the beginning here about how I do a lot of my work kind of intuitively and kind of base the content of the podcast on kind of what the existing narrative of the organization already is. But you said you really take a really specific strategic approach to it. Sometimes it involves deconstructing and starting over and coming up with a whole new strategy. Other times it's taking bits and pieces of what's working. We wanted to make sure and talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I I mean, I love what you said about how you've done this intuitively, because one of my, not just one of my core beliefs, but the reality is that as humans, we're all storytellers. And I feel like, honestly, a lot of the work I end up doing is reminding people of that and reminding people of their own storytelling power. And when we think about how, for a while, actually, I was feeling a little ambivalent about the work that I did, even though I felt very, very strongly called to it, because I was like, well, I'm just being a PR agent, but for the good side. So I'm still kind of being weird and evil, but I'm doing it for the right purposes. So I guess that's okay. And then Ricardo said this thing, Audre Lorde has this quote, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools.
Yep.
And Ricardo offers this footnote saying, that's true, but you have to remember how many tools the master stole from us in the first place. And, right? And so...
That's Ricardo Levins Morales, in case you want to look it up.
Yes. And that just knocked me back on my feet to remind me that what I'm doing and what I'm working to help people to do is to tap into that human storyteller, is to tap into that human dreamer that many of us have had colonized out of ourselves. Some of us still hold on to that. And there's many ways to do that. I in terms of like the concrete things that I do, I offer workshops and trainings in storytelling strategy. I work with organizations. Sometimes they do need to sort of strip everything they've been doing down to its foundation and start again by asking themselves, okay, what are we really here to do? Like, what are we really trying to create in this world, in the state of Minnesota, in our city, at whatever level they're working at? And for other organizations, they might have a good sense of that, but they need to figure out, like, okay, so how can we adapt this for a Twitter audience? How can we adapt this for a foundation? How can we adapt this for legislator without losing our own selves in it? Yeah. And one of the things, actually, concretely, I often feel like I go the opposite direction of traditional communications consultants, because traditional communications consultants will actually have you analyze your audience first, and then you end up with 16, 20 audiences, and you're telling 16, 20 different stories. As opposed to, for me, I really start from the foundation of like, what is the change you're looking to make? What is the world that you want to create? And then how can you tell that same story, but in 16 or 20 different ways, so that you still have that central focus?
So one of the shifts, and this is part of the organizational development and organizing work I do with organizations, because this is where our work overlaps a little bit, is folks often think about communications as an auxiliary organizational function. Yeah. So like the organizers are over there, or the program staff is over there, and then you've got communication that helps those people communicate.
That's part of that nonprofit foundation world, that structure that sort of exists, right?
And part of the movement building work I do, and the now, wow, how systemic work that Eleonore does, is saying, the mission is central. The now, wow, how is how you're going to talk about what's important. Now, how do you then integrate that into every single thing you do? How is your organizing grounded in that? How is your grant making and development organized? Like, how are those folks, the fundraisers, telling that story? How are the organizers telling that story? How are your program staff telling that story? Telling that story. And so it's really moving the whole field that we think of as communication into mission work, rather than auxiliary service. Would you say that?
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And this is actually one of the things that I have just kind of done intuitively. So non-pod, I mean, we're a small operation. You're looking at the whole operation right now. So Eleonore and Beth. So like, I don't have like a team of writers. I don't have a team of like consultants, and you know what I mean? It's generally the way I do the work is I look at, so every organization, right? I figured out a long time ago, every organization, every foundation, they have a mission, right? Like they legally have to like have a mission. And so I just I look at their mission. I'm like, okay, like everything we do on this podcast is going to reinforce that mission. And I mean, I've worked with organizations before where like they're in the process of even sort of reviewing their mission and figuring out who do we want to be and like what do we want to say. But I've been flexible enough to be able to kind of to roll with that. And it's just, I mean, that has been a really easy way for me to create, content on that level. I also wanted to ask you about, so a lot of questions that I get are about using different media. You did mention like crafting something for like a Twitter audience versus this or that. What kind of questions do you get about, you know, when people want to figure out those different sort of avenues for storytelling?
What kind of questions do I get? I mean, I think the basic questions that I get are really the one that you just said, which is like, okay, Eleanor, if we have this grand vision, this grand story, this grand dream, I still need to get that out in 280 characters. You know, I still need to get that out into a 59-second video that I can put onto Instagram, right? And for me, that's actually where a lot of the tools come in, like using the now, wow, how. You can have a sentence per now, per wow, per how, and you come out with about like a 30 to 60 second statement right there, right? There's also a lot of...
Wait, before you go on, and I would suggest that getting it into a sentence for each of them, and I've done some of this work, that if we can't do it, we're not there yet. Because we're like all about blah 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 blah, and frankly, I think we're still colonized. Like when we can actually say, no, this is the world, right? Like I think we've talked before on the podcast when somebody says, like, what is your wow, Beth, right? And we've talked about this before. I say my wow, my reason for existing is I believe that the spirit. I mean, it gets all spiritual, but I believe that the spirit of God, whoever lives in everyone and everything. And it is my job to find those fragments and bring them back together again and repair the world.
Yeah.
Like
you
that.
said something about that in your Facebook post about the Kaleo, about the night of a new day event.
Like that's my wow, right? And that's one sentence, right? And so, you know, when I'm working in leadership development, I'm often pushing people to come to their one sentence wow. Like what is their wow, what is their theory? Because then that gets into their whole theory of change. And if we're not in one sentence for each one of those, I would keep pushing us to go further. Would you agree?
Yeah. Yes, and also similar to, you know, Ricardo Levins-Morales, again, has this concept of the second grade liberation program that if your sentences aren't something that a second grader would be able to really sort of comprehend what you're trying to get towards, then you're also missing... if you're not able to explain it to that level, then you're missing something there.
And that's kind of what got me sort of on that path of like dissecting the mission or vision of an organization. I mean, I think that so a lot of thought at some point went into, you know, mission statements or, you know, a few sentences, whatever, a paragraph. And I assume that at some point a lot of thought went into developing like those sentences, right? That basically define that mission and that vision for the organization. So. I mean, we could go on, and maybe we'll chat after we wrap up here because I definitely want to get a little deeper into this. But we are actually going to wrap up this segment of the podcast. But before we do, we want to let people know where to find you and a little more about the work that you do in general.
Great, yeah. So my email is eleonore@dreamstopower.org. And you can also make an appointment with me at my Calendly scheduling app. So that's calendly.com/EWESSERLE. And I think the thing that I really just wanted to say was, you know, it is important for us to note what the dominant culture, the toxic narrative is. That's actually the first question that I go through with people because we need to know what it is and actually name it and bullet point it out on a document so that we can avoid it. And I think in a lot of cases with what you're talking about with people's you know, mission and the stuff that goes on the website, sometimes there hasn't been that work done of analyzing, okay, what is this dominant toxic narrative? And people can fall into that if they don't do that analysis first.
So way back, I guess it was like the second or third podcast, one of the things that I suggested folks do, maybe homework, is if they're going to watch the news at all, one of the ways to not have you get crazy doing it is give yourself an assignment and watch the news and have a pad there and try to document the dominant narrative that is being reinforced through how the conservators or the right wing are talking and how the news commentators are repeating it.
Yes.
And that's a way to sort of keep yourself sane, but it's also a way of deconstructing the dominant narrative that Eleanor is talking about. So homework.
Right. And homework paired with that is think about like what is the vision that you want for the world and think about that in terms of what's present as opposed to what's absent. So if you start thinking about your vision for the world 50 years from now, I'd like it to be ABC, and you think about, oh, well, I want it to be free from this, I want this to have stopped, really challenge yourself to push yourself to describe, like, okay, if I want the world to be free from transphobia or free from prisons or whatever, how do I describe what I want instead? Because that's really what's going to get us moving forward and moving towards that horizon.
And this has been a special double homework edition of the Beth Zemsky podcast. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for being here. We're going to come right back, and we're going to wrap up with Beth. We're going to let you know what Beth is going to be up to in the near future here. Thanks again, Eleanor, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
And welcome back to the Beth Zemsky podcast, segment 3 of episode 9. I think we decided this is here. So we wanted to let people know what you're going to be up to in the near future, and maybe just quickly summarize what we talked about today.
Well, we talked about a lot of stuff today. I was super excited to have Eleanor here with me to sort of, because one of the things there was pieces of the podcast in the previous ones where I talked somewhat theoretically about talking about the WOW and values-based organizing versus issues-based. So that's part of the reason I was so excited to have Eleanor here to actually talk about a strategy and technique to doing that.
We kind of tied up some loose ends and tied some things together today. That was fun.
Yeah, and I think we had started talking about you coming way back in the end of May or beginning of June, so it took a while to make this happen. So that's exciting, just as Eleanor is about to launch her new consulting practice.
DreamsToPower.org.
Yeah, that's right. So, that would be great to check her out, and I'm looking forward to potentially she and I playing more together. So that's what we talked about today. What I'm up to next is I can't remember if I mentioned this last podcast, but I've got some new folks I'm working with that I'm super excited about, partly because of some of the social conditions that Eleanor was talking about. So one of the folks I'm working with now, beginning of an 18 months to 2-year process, is the Center for Victims of Torture. So some of the kind of horrendous experiences that Eleanor was talking about, that's been a result of U.S. policy. I'm excited about working with that organization that is really trying to do healing and capacity building around the world for folks who work with torture survivors.
It's crazy how small the world is, too, because we mentioned Domestic Abuse Project, that their podcast, the communications director from Domestic Abuse Project is now at Center for Victims of Torture. So it's a really small little bubble we live in here.
Trauma's trauma, right? And doing trauma-informed work. I'm also, Ryan just had finished doing some stuff with HIV and the Red Ribbon Ride. And in a couple of weeks for the, 5th or 6th time, I'm going to be facilitating the HIV Planning Council's every 2-year allocation process about how they give out the Ryan White money. That comes from the feds to grassroots HIV organizations. So super excited about that. Still doing some work with some environmental organizations, some foundations, still working around health equity with Blue Cross Blue Shield. So trying to have my finger in moving lots of different parts of our healthcare system, our environmental system, lots of different systems trying to move forward so we can actually do the WOW that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, both of you again, for being here. And thank you for listening to the Beth Zemsky podcast. We'll see you next time. The Beth Zemsky podcast is a production of the nonprofit podcast community. Subscribe now on iTunes, on Android, or by email at bethzemskypodcast.com.